Hi, my name's Meagan, and today I'll be talking to you about the Australian Labor Party 2016 election climate policy. The Australian Labor Party came into the 2016 federal election as the opposition. The head of the party at the time, who is currently still the head of the party, is Bill Shorten. In this talk, I'll provide you with an overview of the climate change policies that the Australian Labor Party had for the 2016 election, how these policies were viewed by the media and different interest sectors, and how climate policies have evolved over time. Climate policy began to appear as a key inclusion in Australian election policies in the early 1990s, but it wasn't until 2007 that it started to become a key pillar in the suite of election policies provided by both Liberal and Labor governments. In the key climate policies for both the 2007 and 2010 elections, it can be seen that Labor has more ambitious policies in this area. Labor won both the 2007 and 2010 elections. Liberals came out on top for the 2013 and 2016 elections. It can be seen that in 2013, the two parties had a bipartisan approach to climate policy, being that they agreed on policies, which was not the case for the most recent 2016 election. Over time, climate policy targets set by both Labor and Liberals have become more ambitious. For example, in the 2007 election, Labor had a 20% renewable energy target to achieve by 2020, and now has set a 50% target for 2030. While the Liberals' original target of 15% of electricity from low emission sources by 2015 has increased to greater than 20% renewable energy by 2020. Benchmark years for these targets have also shifted over the election periods. This indicates that progress is being made in these sectors and that policy is adjusting to reflect this progress. Within the Labor Party, the main method of achieving climate policy targets has changed dramatically between Labor leaders over the years, with Rudd originally trying to introduce the Carbon Pollution Reduction Scheme, which was eventually rejected by Parliament. Then Gillard had introduced the Clean Energy Future Package, which was commonly known as the carbon tax. It was abolished by the Liberals when they were in power in 2013 and had received distinguishably negative press. Shorten's emissions trading scheme is the most praised of the set to date, and political commentators such as The Conversation are stating that a similar policy to the emissions trading scheme is where the current Liberal government should be heading. Shorten's proposed emissions trading scheme is only part of a suite of policies proposed in the Australian Labor Party's 2016 climate policy. This policy has a focus on 6 key elements: making Australia a leading renewable energy economy, cleaner power generation, building jobs and industry, cutting pollution, capturing carbon on the land, and increased energy efficiency. As shown on the climate policy table earlier, the main targets for the Labor 2016 climate policy were emission reduction targets including net zero pollution by 2050 and 45% emissions reduction on 2005 levels by 2030. They also set a target for renewable energy to achieve 50% of the nation's electricity sourced from renewable energy by 2030. These goals were set to work towards the Paris Agreement to ensure to keep global warming well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. Labor outlined a range of policies to assist them to achieve these targets. These included the reintroduction of ARENA to drive investment in the renewable energy sector, including an investment $206.6 million over 4 years. They also stated that they would restore flexibility to the Clean Energy Finance Corporation to assist with further investment. Labor also proposed policies around introducing mandatory standards for light vehicles, including cars, and introducing land clearing policy at a national level, which has traditionally been managed at a state level. In addition to these and several other policies, the main way that Labor intended to achieve these targets was through the introduction of 2 different emissions trading schemes, one for the national electricity market and one for the rest of the market. These were proposed to cost $355.9 million over 4 years. For the National Electricity Market Trading Scheme, Labor proposed to introduce the capping of emissions and to deliver a clean energy transition mechanism, which they had outlined the 8 key principles for in their policy document to ensure a just transition. This would have been introduced in 2018 and would have been a closed scheme. The cap would be on carbon pollution for each generator, which would have been a baseline calculated according to sector-wide emissions intensity. Therefore, generators with emissions above this baseline would have to buy carbon credits as offsets. Under the Labor government, emitters outside of the electricity market would have also been subject to an emissions trading scheme that would have seen Phase 1 introduced during 2018. This would have placed a cap on pollution produced by liable entities. This emissions trading scheme would have been a blend of cap and trade scheme and a baseline and credit scheme. As described in Flashland, Miskinsky and Edenhofer in 2009, cap and trade systems set a binding absolute cap on total emissions, but allow for certificates corresponding to the right to emit a specific volume of emissions to be traded among the covered entities, such as, in this case, between polluters and on the international market. Flashland, Miskinsky and Edenhofer also noted that in contrast, baseline and credit systems define a certain baseline such as business as usual projection or a relative target and only allow emission reductions that go beyond this baseline to be used as sellable credits, which are often referred to as offsets. For the Labor emissions trading scheme, there would have been a pollution cap on each polluter, based on the average for the sector, and big polluters would have been required to purchase carbon credits to offset emissions above their caps from the international carbon credits market. Agriculture, road transport and refrigerant industries would have been exempt from Phase 1 of this scheme. Phase 2 would have seen these emission caps being reduced over time to reach the zero pollution target by 2050. This emissions trading scheme was noted to be in stark contrast to Turnbull's Emission Reduction Fund, which sees the government purchasing Australian carbon credits rather than polluters paying for the credits. The Emissions Reductions Fund is described as a voluntary scheme that provides incentives for Australian farmers and landholders to adopt new practices and technologies to reduce Australia's greenhouse gas emissions. It runs as a reverse auction conducted by the federal government, with bidders proposing what they can do to reduce emissions for the lowest price. As always, the Liberal Party voiced several concerns around Labor's climate change policies, despite Malcolm Turnbull having previously crossed the floor to support an emissions trading scheme proposed by Labor, which he had to later denounce to be able to take over leadership from Abbott. The main concerns voiced by the Liberals were the ability for polluters to purchase carbon credits for the emissions trading scheme internationally, sending money overseas instead of it remaining within the Australian economy. Environmental Minister Greg Hunt also specifically denounced that Shorten's emissions trading scheme was just another version of Gillard's carbon tax, which, as mentioned earlier, received constant negative press. The Liberals also expressed concerns, which were picked up in the media, such as power bills increasing as a result of Labor's policies, that there was a lack of plans for achieving their high targets released prior to the election, that the introduction of federal land clearing laws would take away land use rights, and that closing coal-fired power stations would cause mining and manufacturing industries to collapse. In addition to reporting on the Liberals' views of the Labor policies, the different media sources also had opinions on Labor's policies which were mixed. While The Age, The New Daily and Canberra Times claimed that Labor were courageous and showed insight, that they had set ambitious targets, and that they had strong renewable energy policies, the Australian Financial Review and news.com.au were not as positive, claiming that the renewable energy scheme was doubted by industry and that Labor's policies were vague. Different sectors also provided their response to Labor's policies in the media. The agricultural sector expressed concerns over land rights, which were mostly through the voice of the federal Liberal Agricultural Minister, Mr. Joyce. One of these expressions from Mr. Joyce was a concern over private land use rights with the introduction of federal land clearing laws. However, the National Farmers Federation President, Brett Finlay, did also say that farmers would bear the brunt of Labor's climate change policy, which placed the cost of achieving ambitious climate change targets firmly on the shoulders of Australian farmers, and that some aspects of the policy would cause initial alarm, but there is no doubt it is good to see the policy includes some positive sentiments like reinvigorating the carbon farming initiative. As usual, the Labor policies were supported by unions, including the Transport Workers Union and the United Firefighters Union. They also received strong support from the environmental sector, with John Connor, CEO of the Climate Institute, who welcomed the 45% commitment but said that it should be regarded as a minimum. He also welcomed the measures to start phasing out coal-fired power, saying the shocks to jobs and communities risk being greater now because of inaction in recent years, but he called for the phase-out to be done within 20 years instead of by 2030. Jeff Cousins, president of the Australian Conservation Foundation, also praised Labor, saying that the ALP stepped up early in the election campaign with strong renewable energy policies. However, in the end, Liberals won the 2016 election over Labor and their strong climate policy.